There's also new reporting tonight on what actually happened when Yevgeny Prigozhin launched that military assault inside Russia and started sending his troops toward Moscow. Still not clear exactly why he stopped that assault and what deal may have been made. But tonight, we do have a clearer picture of what may have been going on in the Kremlin in the early hours of the incursion by Wagner forces. It comes from the Washington Post. Their headline, Putin appeared paralyzed and unable to act in first hours of rebellion. Shane Harris shares the byline of that story, joins us now. Shane, can you just walk us through your reporting of what happened in the Kremlin during the first hours of the Prigozhin rebellion? Because it paints a very different picture of Vladimir Putin than people are used to seeing or believing.
Yeah, that's right, Anderson. Really, to put it succinctly, what happened was not what officials were expecting to see, which is namely that Vladimir Putin was not apparently giving orders that were then traveling down the chain of the military command to local commanders and security officials who would have been trying to stop Prigozhin on this lightning strike that he was making up north to Moscow. And as sources described it to us, there was paralysis and indecision coming from Moscow and from the leadership. CIA Director Bill Burns said last week that Russian leaders appeared to be adrift as this incredible scene was playing out. So really kind of a picture not of a Russian leader in command, but one that was indecisive and potentially afraid to try to counter Prigozhin, this warlord who's depended on so much in the war in Ukraine.
Which is such a blow to kind of the mystique of Vladimir Putin, a mystique he himself has worked hard to try to create.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one reason why this was such a telling series of events. We all watched as Prigozhin really directly challenged and tried to undermine, I think, Putin's rule and authority. He said his beef was with the military leadership and the defense establishment, but really that's also a shot at the Russian president himself. And now to see that essentially there was silence and indecision, people down the chain waiting for Putin to tell us, what do you want us to do, after he had gone on national television and talked about trying to squelch this rebellion. It's very much at odds with that portrait that he portrays of someone who is in total command, who demands authority, who demands loyalty. This seemed to be somebody who was, on his back foot and really not clear on what exactly he wanted, and that's not even sure that he had a plan for how he wanted to counter this. Right?
And all the more interesting because you report that he actually had some advance warning. He had intelligence from Russian security services. How do you know how far in advance, or what did he know?
Our sources tell us that about 2 days in advance, he was given warning that something was afoot, that Prigozhin may have been planning something. And there were indications of that among Western intelligence as well. And there were fortifications made at key establishments in Moscow, including around the Kremlin. Weapons were handed out. So at least in that initial phase, it does seem like this is someone who's getting ready for some kind of attack. But then these orders on what to do after that never really come. And then, of course, we all sort of watch as Prigozhin stops and this deal gets hammered out with the president of Belarus. So still things that we don't know about that in particular and why Prigozhin ultimately stopped. But Putin did have some warning that this person who he'd come to depend on was potentially going to make a move. And as we saw, he did in the military headquarters in the south of Russia and then turned his sights on Moscow.
It was also interesting to see kind of the reaction, or I guess I should say lack of reaction, among local officials in some of the regions between Rostov-on-Don and Moscow.
Yeah, I think this is where they would have been looking up the chain of command to the military headquarters and saying, essentially, what is it that you want? And with no word coming down, they were really kind of left to interpret this for themselves. And again, this is much more, I think, in keeping with the image that we've seen, frankly, of the Russian military for more than a year now in Ukraine, where the lack of central communication, coordination, it appears to be often a kind of lumbering apparatus where the left hand often doesn't know what the right is doing. But this, again, I think does go squarely down to Putin as somebody who would have had to give orders in this kind of urgent situation for what he wanted done. The people on the locals on the ground were just sort of left listening and waiting and trying to make it up for themselves.
The Washington Post reports that on the night of the rebellion, the Putin was essentially paralyzed and unable to act decisively. In those initial hours, he was silent. So lower level officials were waiting, and they were waiting for somebody to give guidance on what was going to happen, what they were going to do. Your reporting also shows something quite powerful about what was happening in those hours.
Yeah, we actually broke the story on your program that in the night of the supposed coup, of the abortive coup, top generals from the military intelligence were not as interested as you would expect them to be in resolving the situation. And when we analyzed further those phone calls, hundreds and hundreds of phone calls of many GRE officers, we found that the top GRE officer in charge of waging the war in Ukraine,
The top GRU
the
officer.
top GRE officer, he's the number 2 in the whole GRU system, and he was in charge of Ukraine. He called his girlfriend more than 40 times in the middle of the night. It seemed like they were binge watching on a show, like talking to each other. What do you think will happen next? He only called his colleague a total of 10 times, like the top ranking colleague that he called was called 10 times, so 40 times to his girlfriend. This is not serious. That clearly he was
Right.
not.
In the middle of a potential coup.
Yeah.
That's not what you would be doing.
No. But we also know, and we've reported, our investigative partner, The Insider, reported a couple of days in a very good story where they we called some of the participants some of the officials that agreed to talk to us to ask them what they did on that day, on that evening. And many of them were honest enough to say, well, we just waited it out. I mean, one of them even said, I continued drinking because I didn't want to be summoned to work. I just didn't want to take a side in this.
Wow.
So they just waited. They were on the fence.
Apathetic.
Yeah.
So, okay, now, which is really incredible, right? Not rushing to the defense, not even just the gossiping on it, as you say, almost, it seems. So you're reporting also on some drone attacks against Russia. Now, we've obviously heard about the Moscow attack this week and against Crimea, but you have some new details there.
Well, I mean, what is interesting now is that this must have been the most sort of numerous attacks by drones performed by Ukraine during the war. I counted at least 20, maybe 21 drones launched on that day, 2 days ago, to Russia from Ukrainian territory. I mean, there's no doubt that these didn't come from places inside Russia. These came from Ukrainian territory. That is very, very important because while in Crimea, where approximately 17 drones were reported sighted, and one of them hit a munition depot, right. It takes a much bigger power of these drones to reach Moscow. That's at least 600 kilometers, about 400 miles to get from the closest border point to Moscow. And at least three of these drones reached Moscow. 2 of them hit locations downtown in Moscow. One of them hit Komsomolsky Prospect number 20. That is the address that houses the most secretive cyber offensive unit of the GRU, the same unit that actually interfered with elections in the United States in 2016, 2018. Again, they tried, this is the so-called Fancy Bear headquarters. A Ukrainian drone got all the way there. And it didn't destroy the building, but you could see its debris just in front of this secretive location. It's not a good sign for Russia. And another drone was found crashed right next to another communications facility, which coordinates all the communication between the Navy ships of Russia. Again, this is just a show of force, and a future attack with more drones is likely to actually cause much, much more damage.
Right, and they have the intel to know exactly where all these places are, which showing that proof. All right, Christo, thank you very much.